Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another GCS podcast expert interview with the wonderful Jaydon Inott, one of the leading GMP advisors in the UK, and one of the very few who has gone out and earned those hard-fought licenses from the government. Jaydon's very kindly offered to share some of his expertise and experience with us to guide us through really what it looks like to go from idea all the way through to licensed medicine and the regulatory journey in between there, demystifying it, seeing what it looks like, and rather than pushing against the regulations, how we can use the regulations to help create a pathway to creating licensed and approved medicines that can be used by the public and prescribed by doctors. So little introduction for you there, Jaydon. I don't know if you want to put a bit more meat on the bone to the people that are listening and introduce them to your 20 years of experience in the field of pharmaceutical clinical trials and development.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me. Fantastic to connect with you and the GTS community. Fully recognise the role you're playing in empowering the industry and the positive force you're having within it. So it's great to be part of that, and I hope to be more so part of it now we've connected. So and that's been great. So my background originally is in clinical research and development. I moved directly into that from my biotech undergrad and worked in there for over 16 years. So if anyone who doesn't know that space, that's a very broad discipline with many different professionals working within it. So let me clarify that a little bit. I used to manage large late phase clinical trials in the full project cycle. So from concept sheet through to final patient, cross-functional kind of coordination role. Yeah, and the change in legislation in 2018 really come kind of at the end of a period of transformation and change for myself personally in my career, where I'd initially focused on sustainable agriculture and development, which I still carry forward in very interesting ways in this industry, as you can imagine, but then really focused on my efforts on developing natural medicines to leverage and make best of my background and my expertise. So around 2018 I was working on a cannabinoid development program which we subsequently had approved. That change in legislation meant that we saw that there was a need and opportunity to build a supply chain that worked to meet the unmet clinical need outside of our trials, both for patients who were coming off the trial and also for other clinical indications in the unlicensed medicine space. So that evolved very quickly, and I became the first employee into what became Spectrum Therapeutics under the Beckley Canopy joint venture, which I was in from pretty much the start. And we built the facility, got it licensed, sat with the chief pharmacist to have national guidelines amended to make the supply chain work better. I know there's a great deal of work to do there still, but we avoided patients from waiting 3 months from the point of prescription, which as it was at the time, and made for what could be a reliable supply chain. And being a patient-focused group, we then saw our role within the distribution business that we now had to be to assure continuity of treatment. So we made that our absolute kind of focus and goal, and very happy to say that we did achieve that for the first cohort of patients with our products, but it's not easy, and I have a great deal of empathy for everyone who's involved in the process for knowing the challenges that's involved there, and the journey that we need to go on to improve it further. From there, I founded a consultancy business and since supported licensing across multiple sites for import distribution, cultivation, and now full GMP implementation projects. I'm working in an extraction facility, hopefully to unveil soon with their certification, and pull together a group of obviously technical experts within that, and stepped up into a coordination role for GMP implementation projects, which meant that I've learned more about pharmaceutical manufacturing than I ever thought I would in my career. But that's a really critical component to clinical development as well, as you can imagine, making sure you've got the appropriate controls in place and such like. So my kind of focus on my personal kind of draw, I guess, towards detail and systems has led me to be more and more involved in quality and quality management, also because that has the best impact on patient outcomes. And I've become a MHRA quality controller, responsible person, and a lead GMP auditor through that as well. So it's been quite the journey. And we've also attained 3 clinic licenses within the group, and through our partners bring deep expertise in pharmacy operations. So really we're positioned to help pull all the pieces together in a coherent end-to-end strategy from manufacturing to patient access, which is really great. It's an exciting position to be in. So you could say that personally I work now at the intersection of pharmaceutical manufacturing, GMP, and clinical development. I'm proud to say we've got a team of excellent professionals, humans, to carry that forward. And yeah, we've expanded our consulting offering to encapsulate all of that. I can release some more details on that soon. It's a company called FINA Consulting. And we have our own clinical development company, BioMRx, which exists exclusively to take a cannabinoid formulation through clinical development. So our mission within all of that, and particularly with BioMRx, is to expand expand access to affordable clinically validated treatment for patients, ultimately have it reimbursed on the NHS and beyond. Yeah, so on a real personal note, I'm passionate about how natural products can deliver real value in mainstream medicine, and that's not just from an idealistic standpoint. It's not just as alternatives, but as scientifically grounded therapeutics, which I've done a huge amount of work on with myself and colleagues. We really see that, the complexity of the natural formulation, multiple actives, provides complementary and layered on mechanisms of action that can target complex conditions in really interesting ways and unique ways that are differentiated from synthetic alternatives. So that's something that really motivates us, seeing the clinical benefit that can come and the unique opportunity. They also offer a low risk, high impact development pathway compared to some other synthetic alternatives, which I really think pharmaceutical companies have overlooked. And it's especially when you consider the safety profile and the patterns of real world data use that they come with. So that can be a very attractive risk-reduced development opportunity for companies. I'm very happy to expand on that to anyone who's interested in going down that route, and hopefully they will be by the end of this talk. Yeah, zooming out a bit further, there's a wider lens for me personally, an important part of my why, if you like, outside of the clinical benefits and all we've talked about, is that if we can validate these products through trusted frameworks, we open the door not just to medical outcomes, but to broader ecological and behavioural ones as well. And that's probably more of a kind of a social chat or one around the fire or something like that,
We shall dig in. I'm
yeah, sure. We're happy to dig into that as much as you like within this podcast. So yeah.
Thank you, Jaydon. Well, I think my first, maybe most basic question for you to sort of introduce and walk people through the quite lengthy processes that go on behind the scenes, and obviously the pace of those can be quite taxing as well. It takes a long time, and maybe the iteration feedback times take a bit of extra time than expected. But what do you find are some of the most common misconceptions that people have around the sort of complexity of those clinical development pathways and processes, and then also then possibly the simplicity of it? Can it be done? Can it be made simple? And are there maybe ways of approaching the regulations that could be more efficient rather than...
Yeah,
I think what I see quite a lot is people complaining and banging their heads against the wall and feeling quite disillusioned by that process. Whereas for you, I think you can see it as being quite a harmonious relationship. So what are some of the main misconceptions that you find people have around entry and development as you speak to them?
Okay, maybe we could address some of those misconceptions. And one of
Yeah.
them, from a commercial perspective, unfortunately, it's something we have to consider within the mix, is the protection, the IP protection, that you can't protect a natural product,
Yeah.
and that is something that is not inherently true. There are patent protection mechanisms you can bring in place, and the reason why I bring that is just through, when you do get into this space of looking for moving into clinical development, you do need funds. That's a reality of life, and you do have to speak to investors, and the first thing they're going to ask you about is your protection in the market. So that you do have there is a way to a defensible position there. The other misconception I find, I think that's one of the main misconceptions. I think another broader misconception is maybe that, a natural product doesn't fit within the framework and can't move through it. And that is dependent on your product form that you're using, right? Whether it's dried cannabis or extracts. And we can talk more about that. But there is an established framework to follow, and the herbal medicines regulations are in place. They're not easy to navigate. They need a huge amount of technical expertise to do so, and that feeds all the way from your manufacturing site through to your regulatory dossier, and how that's positioned. But it exists. It's there. There's a framework there. And coming to my point, that's kind of there's an established framework for us to follow to take these medicines to licensed medicines, which means that then they can be used in broader access. And unlike when GW Pharma got their formulation over the line, there is now a way to also make that cost effective and reimbursed.
So on that note then, Jaydon, to give maybe people who are a bit naive to some of the pharmaceutical regulations, there's a lot of newcomers to the cannabis industry, for example, that want to develop new medicines. Could you give us a rough, I guess, staged outline of what that actually looks like from sort of like an ideas perspective through to actually getting some approval, submitting dossiers? What are those key steps as you sort of see them?
Well, I think what I see a lot of is companies moving, and my clients and such like that I've worked with, the companies moving into this space with, from a different area, maybe not from pure pharmaceutical background, and then getting immersed in the development of a manufacturing site, and that manufacturing site, the GMP process, and setting that up. Kind of mushrooming and becoming a huge effort in itself, and there's so that in itself is a huge achievement, just to have that set up, and that's your facility and your manufacturing processes. Now, to take it to the next level on top of that, which is to set up a clinical development program and go to slightly more stringent levels of control within your manufacturing process to meet the needs of that, is I found that it seems to be just a bit of a step too far for most companies in this space, and we kind of conceived that, well, with our expertise we can kind of help to support that for a very select group of manufacturers that we might want to be able to support in that direction. So that's kind of where I see there's been a bit of a barrier. Obviously that's linked into capital and etc. requirements that the company had to and exhausted in their efforts to set up their manufacturing effort, which then has delayed. And then the other thing I think is that, with that being the case, is just knowing what expertise to bring in and when. Like if you sat with someone and they said, I know everything about clinical development, I'd be extremely cautious of them, because it's hugely cross-functional and interdisciplinary. So it's about knowing what do you need to bring in and when, and how to structure it, and also knowing that there's a very big difference between academic research and commercially sponsored research. So commercially sponsored research, think what you will of it, is a means by which you can really turn the regulatory dial by having it fully submitted to regulators and approved. Okay, and the two are absolutely worlds apart. So yeah,
that's an interesting separation to make there, Jaydon, because I think a lot of people just brush the research under one rug, not realizing that there's the sort of outcome-driven commercial research versus the sort of exploratory academic research that is then used to maybe target drugs.
Absolutely, and something I hear something I hear quite often is, obviously, there's 10,000 research papers out there, and why aren't regulators listening? And it's because those research projects, to a large extent, haven't followed that pathway, which is critical to prospectively have your research plans and your manufacturing process submitted, reviewed ahead of collecting data.
Mm-hmm. And from a sort of investor perspective as well, you mentioned there's a lot of sort of overheads and run-up costs before you even started doing any research and commercial development. How do you see investors sort of, like, what are they looking for in these projects when they are being sort of pitched, and what do you see as some of the main sticking points that will sort of red flag you almost from that investor perspective? Again, it's a lot of money up front. What are they sort of trying to sort of pick out within those like research projects and different ventures?
Yeah, I mean, what the investors are looking for is dependent on what investors you're pitching to, right? So if you're pitching to cannabis investors or more general investors that are looking for just pure kind of market, a market approach in the unlicensed space or other markets, then obviously that's a different discussion to one where you're pitching to a sophisticated biotech fund that knows the clinical development process and can what it is that you're trying to achieve and the value accrual you can achieve through the process. So I think that's probably another hit on maybe another kind of disconnect there, is that the investor group within the current cannabis space is probably more the former rather than the latter.
And in your eyes, is there a way that and people pitching those projects can make themselves more attractive? Would it be the team?
Absolutely.
Is it the sort of portfolios themselves that people go for? Is it a sort of combination of that and other factors?
Absolutely. And we've done over the last 2 years a lot of work on that outside of consulting, anytime we can carve to develop investor ready packages aligned with that. That encapsulates a full kind of investment strategy, as well at various points with deliverables and all the rest marked out within the plan leading towards launching a trial. So yeah, we've done a lot of work on that. And can it change? Yes, I believe it can. Absolutely. You can bring and something I care about passionately, bringing that language into the mix to validate our approach and take it forward. It's absolutely possible, I believe.
I was speaking to someone the other day, and we sort of made the distinction between sort of like visionary visual people that communicate with sort of like ideas, and then like the words and the language that people, like the essential fundamental language and words that you have to use to sort of, I guess, I don't know if it's meeting the regulations or sort of ticking the boxes within the different sort of like requirements, but I just find constantly that it seems as though, I don't know, going back to maybe the commercial and academic split, but then the commercial cannabis industry split and the maybe pharmaceutical cannabis, medical cannabis split. And I don't know if you want to dive into that
split. Yeah, we can dive into this. We've talked about the first split. We can talk about the second split a little bit more, the commercial and the or the recreational use and the medical use a bit more. But Yeah, I think just something that came through as you were talking there was just that the way I see it, you've got you need investment expertise, commercial and investment expertise and strategy. And then you need expertise in, the regulations that frame it. So you could look at those two things kind of framing your activities. And then underneath that, you need to know all the dependencies and the activities and how they fit within that plan, if you like, and that comes to everything from, right from the manufacturing base to developing out your dossier for your product to, and the timing of your regulatory engagements and all that, and progressively kind of like incrementally improving that picture to then go to that audience of investors that will be attuned to what you're trying to achieve.
Is there an analogy or a sort of mental visual that you would compare that development process to, sort of outside of pharma? It's a bit of a, I'm throwing a bit of a live testy, but yeah, maybe scrap that bit, honestly, Jaydon. I was just having to think, like, I'm trying to like help people picture it a little bit more, because it is it can be quite ethereal. But I think what you were saying there with stacking makes a lot of sense. So maybe if we touch on some of that, like recreational medical divide slightly, and I think maybe this is where it'd be good to talk about the significance of good manufacturing practices and GMP as well, and sort of the guardrails that sort of places on companies and the products that they're producing. But also then there's all benefits of that as well. It's not just there as a nuisance, costly hurdle to jump. It has and is a worthwhile, valid, internationally recognized process for reliable drug production. How do you sort of see that coming together?
So okay, well, yeah, let's look at the separation of recreational medical, then bounce into that a little bit because it will feed into it nicely, I think. Obviously in my mind there's two paths here. There's one, the framework that I've loosely described, clinical development and licensing as a pharmaceutical, and two, waiting for deliberately changes in legislation for broader recreational adult use, as you've seen in Canada and elsewhere. If you look at those two pathways, one has an established framework to follow and has been followed many times, right? And that's there. The other one is and yeah, it's not easy and all the rest, but it's there. And then the other one is, well, that's dependent upon political will, and it's to some degree speculative, right, as to A, whether it happens, and B, in what form it happens, as we saw in Germany. So for me personally, despite my my personal passion and focus for medical use, I'd see just from a objective standpoint that I would prefer to go with that safer established framework rather than a speculative one. And also then feeding into manufacturing stuff is that obviously one thing that could be kind of leveled at you for saying that is say, well, yeah, but the governments might change, you might get legalization soon, then you're not going to have a business because everyone can get it on the street and from shops and all the rest, and you've lost it. And that's not the case either, because there's clear differentiation between the products that you would use in the recreational setting and ones that would use in medical. So dried cannabis, gummies, all those things that you see rolling out in Canada, they fit very well in the recreational use sector. They do not fit in the medical development area. At least they are used medically, and they can be used medically in the unlicensed market, as we've seen. But when you're looking at taking them through clinical development, it's not really feasible. So, you know, the extracts that you have, the ones that can, you know, more closely resemble and fit the requirements of pharmaceutical medical use, those will, I believe, always have a space, and they will always have a space as a licensed medication if we can bolster them with the data that they need. So irrespective of what happens in one area, there'll always be a space in the other. But just personally, I think that I prefer to go with an established framework and focus on and allow that to guide how we are delivering patient outcomes with consistency in dose use within a medical setting, etc.
It's interesting because I hear a lot of, I think predominantly the perspectives you hear around cannabis and medicine and how it should roll out within the industry, sort of that non-pharma perspective, and they haven't seen how the current medical infrastructure works. And they just sort of see it as an enemy rather than like, oh, well, look, actually, there's pathways there that could make this feasible and could create great medicines at the end of the development process. But that's a big difference and a world away almost from just raw cannabis plants and raw consumption and crude consumption. And there's a lot of refinement and precision that can be added to the process of delivering cannabinoids to the human body in a therapeutic way, as opposed to crude, throw all the cannabinoids at the body and hope for the best. There's quite a lot of, well, there's a complex physiology of humans to navigate, and then the regulations are there to show you how to do that in a an informed and a repeatable systematic way. And so for people that maybe aren't aware of some of the GMP processes or license application processes, what does that look like, and what should people be prepared for ahead of time before they do tackle and go down that route? Because it's highly competitive, as we've talked about previously, but then also there's a lot of detail that needs to be incorporated into there. What should people be wary of before they start approaching that? Because that is probably one of the biggest questions and the number one golden ticket that everyone's sort of chasing at the moment.
Yeah, and obviously the requirements depend on what kind of facility and site we're talking about here. If it's a a GMP manufacturing site, so if it's a GACP cultivation site, or if it's an import distribution site, and there are differences, drastic differences there, of course, in both the requirements and the journey involved. But I'd say that just as a general principle, making sure that you are front loading your project with a great deal of due diligence before you get going on it. We're talking about, in all of those instances, you're talking about a big journey, right, to go through, developing the systems, the facility, building the team, getting through your regulatory inspections. It's not for the light-hearted, it's for the highly funded, unfortunately, generally as well. Because it takes money to go, it does take capital to go the journey, and I wish that wasn't so much the case, but it's a reality. Meeting those requirements is takes a lot, and like, so if I have an early stage client come to me, we would do some like pre-build out, for example. Then we would do a great deal of like financial modeling and such like to make sure that they are, as much as possible, we're all aware of what's involved in that journey. Is that budget all kind of accounted for, and in the end of the day, is it going to deliver a profitable business? I mean, we have done that exercise for a few groups and actually found that no, that the ideas they had weren't going to pull, weren't going to be sustainable. So that's one area. The other area would be if we're coming in later in the project, say it's already going and there's infrastructure in place and such like, is doing a gap analysis of them being ready towards GMP certification, for example, or GDP, depending on what it is. Doing a gap analysis of their systems and then plotting out a path from there with a project implementation plan to get what's needed in place. So there are various kind of approaches there tailored to the entry point that we come in at, I guess. But I think one thing to be aware of is just it's a journey. It's one hell of a thing to commit to. You don't do it lightly, and you need to focus heavily on bringing in the right expertise along the journey to do that, and someone who can, outside of the technical expertise in any one area, offer some coordination of all those pieces of the puzzle. And that's where I personally like to come in, but we also then offer some of the deeper technical expertise within the group.
You made me think of something there, Jaydon. Compared to with the cannabis industry as it stands and the sort of companies that are coming to develop cannabinoid medicines, what sort of differences do you see between what you've seen in your past pharmaceutical experience versus the current approach that cannabis companies are taking? Do you see any contrasts or different approaches in like mindset that are different, or is it resources that you see as the sort of key differentiators? Like what is it that cannabis companies maybe are falling short on or could do better to make it easier all around for everyone?
Yeah, well, I think less what cannabis companies are getting wrong, more just that being real about what's happening, what you're trying to achieve. You've got a startup company in the cannabis space, fine, startup company in the cannabis space. What you've actually got is a startup pharmaceutical company, right? And a pharmaceutical company, we all have some level of awareness of the level of regulations that are involved there, and the level of infrastructure, etc., that they need to have. You're trying to take that and kind of put that within a startup environment, being cost sensitive, making it achievable to get to your minimum viable kind of offering, if you like. And it's about being able to, it's almost like taking a basketball and trying to put it through the eye of a needle, really. You're trying to you wouldn't want to get someone who's just been working in big pharma, and I don't mean this in any drawing way, because it's a journey I've been on for the last 8 years. You wouldn't want to go and just have someone from being in blue chip big pharma to then, right, here you are, startup environment, make that work, because you'd be used to completely different team structures and systems than you need in a leaner kind of startup model.
I think a lot of people do end up just hiring straight from pharma, don't they, and think, oh, we'll just copy paste it over and it'll all be the same. And it is a lot of, as you're saying, sort of learning on the job, different structures, different resources as well that are available. So you've got to be quite entrepreneurial is maybe the term to
multidisciplinary. It really is like a learn whatever it takes kind of mentality, because no one person is ever going to know everything.
So I've got on my notes here big questions from people that are going through audits at the moment, and I was wondering if you might be able to talk us through that slightly, where people fall short, potential risks as well of not really paying attention to those audits. Obviously, I see a lot of people taking it seriously, but there's a lot of nuance there to it. And again, depending on what's being audited, do you have any general guidance to people that are either preparing for audits or are facing audits or sort of having, that's a new process that they're having to navigate as well? What could people be doing to make that less painful for themselves?
Well, your last question of what's the differences in pharma and cannabis companies, there's a big difference in this area, in that if you look at pharmaceutical companies, they'll have a team of auditors with a sophisticated auditing system in place, and then you come into the cannabis space, it's like, do we need audits? Yes, you do. In a certain setting, right? It's context dependent. If you're a WDA holder with a QP release going on elsewhere, then the requirements are lighter. If you're not that, and you're, as let's say, an MS holder, and you're bringing in, I'm getting a bit stuck in detail there, but if you're a manufacturing site with suppliers, absolutely you need to do risk-based auditing. Yeah, I think just like with the GMP setup area, just kind of like reframing the role of quality within all of this a little bit, right? This is a journey I've personally been on, because I sat in big pharma, having to do all the SOPs, going, oh, is this really needed, and is this and being a bit delusional about it when you can't see the broader picture. But really, like, having a well-functioning, good quality team is not only just to protect your license and your business into the future. It sounds a bit cheesy, it's true. It's the engine room of your company. It's where any changes that you make happen. Any innovation that you want to make has to go through, and they're the people who understand your business the most through the processes that you have to develop, right? So that's why I personally gravitated towards quality and that focus. And within that, obviously, auditing is a part of that. And auditing, in the same way, could just be seen as a tick box exercise, that something you have to beat and do, or you say, right, it's something we have to do, but let's use it to our advantage. Let's optimize the use of this audit. Let's make it so that it's an opportunity, actually, not just to tick that box, but to understand our supplier, to understand how they operate, and to align on operational kind of processes, right? Okay, and then understand what the risk is for the products coming in, and how we kind of then manage that relationship going forward. So there's a huge opportunity for not just understanding, but also operational alignment within an audit. And my personal view is, if you've got to do it properly.
It's interesting that you've framed it that way, rather than it being a pain. Well, how can we actually use this as a opportunity to incorporate this into our strategy, or add some impact and value to the business? Do you find, on that note, sort of, there's what's written in paper in the processes, but then the actual operations of the company as well? Do you find that there's, like, laws, for example, the law is that cannabis is illegal for the majority of people, but we've still got 1.8 million consumers. Do you find, and do you see, and have you seen, I suppose, in the pharmaceutical world too, that there's a difficulty in applying the black and white binary text to the realities of business operations?
Yeah, I mean, there's these I hold a huge amount of respect for our regulators, for the processes that they've put in place, because they are intelligently designed, and they do work if you use them right. A large part of a big component of an audit is assessing that correlation between practice and process, right? And there are other kind of oversight mechanisms within a quality system that also mean internal assessment and ongoing review of that. So if done right, that works. And it's a huge amount of investment, but again, it just comes back to my point. It's something you need to do anyway. Saves your company, it protects your company from regulatory risks, and if done right and leveraged in the right way, it adds value to the business hugely.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do just see it as like a box ticking exercise, when in reality there's a lot that it's a unique perspective I've heard, in that it can be I've never people don't usually talk about it positively, do they? It's sort of like, oh god, I'm doing an audit, and we've got to do our SOPs. Have you seen many that have failed those audits, and what might some of the causes for a fail be in that sense?
Yeah, there have been failed audits, I mean, and also failed inspections. It's worth noting that just in the GDP area, I think I did a review of revoked and suspended licenses over the last 12 months, and I counted 19.
Wow, okay.
So and that's in the broader, that's just cannabis, it's broader landscape. So when we talk about regulatory risk and protecting your company, that's not just lip service, that's very real. And I've known, you know, some companies I've helped with remediation work that have been in that space. They're not the companies you would expect to find themselves
Right.
there, right? They're good teams, professional. They just didn't quite manage to meet certain requirements. So there's a number of reasons why the fail of an audit or an inspection, and in the end of the day, it comes down to an accumulation of risks leading to you know, patient risk and lack of control in your processes. That would be the main kind of, I guess, a high level summary of why companies would fail.
Going back to then maybe the political side of things, Jaydon, are there changes politically that you think would benefit potentially the pharmaceutical route to development, or are there barriers that you see at the moment in terms of legislation that maybe delay or inhibit some of that phytochemical cannabinoid related
Well,
drug development, or is it
yeah,
self-limiting per se?
yeah. Well, it depends on, I guess what you the pathway you're trying to go through, right? If you're trying to say we've got all these research papers and we've got some real world evidence data, change the system and approve these products, absolutely, there's huge barriers to that. Legislative barriers grounded in the human medicines regulations in the case of the UK and broadly, you know, across the world elsewhere, you know, the same framework elsewhere, you know, trying to push the message for, let's say, real world evidence use to support product licensing. Something I've looked into deeply. I've sat with in conferences with the chief medical officer of the EMA, who ran a course on this, and you know, yeah, there's huge barriers there, and I wouldn't pin your hopes on that. And I wouldn't pin your hopes on. I think it's entirely possible that there would be a change in political will and in any country to open up to, you know, recreational adult use of cannabis in a controlled way, and that would be positive and all the rest. But again, it's wholly dependent on things outside of your control, and it's not something that and there's differentiation from that in the medical use always, I'd say. So
Interesting. I think a lot of people will be quite entertained or interested in your perspective on waiting for that political willpower to change things. So I know I hear a lot of concerns from businesses or people that are working in the cannabis industry saying that decriminalization, should it come along, would mean that all those companies would lose value on their medical, well, on the value of their IP and sort of development processes. And I think that's probably a pretty good myth to bust, Jaydon, honestly, because I think people don't really understand. I think cannabis people, industry influencers and opinion leaders definitely see like crude cannabis and the cannabis flower as the ultimate perfect endpoint for cannabis medicinal utility, whereas I think we know, and I can see entertained by that too, that there's actually a lot more that could be done, and there's a whole new generation of medicines, drugs and treatments that can come out of that raw cannabis flower. And I think for both of us it's quite frustrating to see maybe how some of that vision is maybe lost or murky, and then thrown in recreational tendencies as well. I think if it does go down the adult use, maybe again, that might mean that a lot of the wonderful drugs, treatments, and diagnostic tools that could be created are sort of getting lost in that recreational movement. And it maybe means that some of those legitimate medical breakthroughs are sort of being lost in the smoke or downplayed because the recreational marketing around cannabis sort of overshadows that slightly, and I guess has more funding, can say what it wants, and does say what it wants a lot of the time for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, let's dive into that a little bit. Let's break that down a bit more, because yeah, I think that point I was talking about, and that differentiation, and the medical use always being differentiated and protected from whatever happens elsewhere, is dependent on innovation, as you're highlighting, right? Innovation in the product forms and the delivery mechanisms, so that you can meet the needs of medical patients more, right? The dried cannabis format, it's obviously immensely useful, and I respect that. It's immensely useful to patients out there and used in the unlicensed market for medical purposes. But when you starting to look at it for broader use, consistency of dose, the method of administration, all of those things, the controls that you need to have in place from a manufacturing perspective, it really does fall short on many, and the stability that you've got, the shelf life, I can list it all off on, it does fall short, and it would be useful in the recreational space, whereas an optimized advanced formulation that can deliver on all of those things will be hugely differentiated from. And let's now talk about like market dynamics and how that might go, and where the opportunity is. Sure, if there was a change in legislation and broader use for which I hope would happen, more controllable recreational use out there, great. That's one big opportunity. We've covered how it's speculative and outside of our control and due to political will, but that's one big opportunity. Sure, I just wouldn't want to hang my hat on it. Then there's the medical use, and what we see now. I'm a little bit out of touch on the figures, but maybe 60,000 patients in the UK. That's nothing compared to what you would be able to access if you went through the licensing process and had it reimbursed in the NHS, right? 60,000 patients is a decent market. It's great. It's a great loads of traction. We're all proud of the access that we've been able to enable, but it's nothing compared to the expansion that you can have in not just one, multiple therapeutic indications, okay, that cannabis can be applied to. So we're looking at a whole physiological system that hasn't been studied or understood, that can be put to good use in the treatment of disorders. So
I'd love your perspective on something as well, Jaydon. At the moment, we've got a lot of cannabis coming in from, say, overseas that has been imported here under the medical protections. But I don't know if you see this too. I feel like there's quite a lot of blurring now between that medical cannabis prescribing ecosystem and a bit of infiltration of the sort of North American recreational mindset or tendencies, particularly, say, the cannabis names that have been prescribed over here and the strain names that are sort of AK-47. I'm going to throw it out there. Gorilla Glue. Again, I'm sure it's great, has wonderful effects medically for people, but what problems do you see, having been on the pharma side of the fence, as to how companies are sort of almost flaunting some of the regulations in that sense, and going back to maybe licenses being sort of cancelled and cut down? Do you see any of those same risks occurring with clinics, with some of the prescribing conversations that go on, and then also on social media, the marketing around that too? What sort of problems do you see there from like a compliance perspective, or potentially regulatory backlash that could come from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to think that just because something so far hasn't been enforced or looked on, that's not going to be the case into the future. The requirements and that you have to meet are clear. The MHRA are very good in outlining what they are, but at the same time, you know, we have to appreciate that this is a new area and it's new for everyone, including the MHRA. So they are going to evolve their knowledge and their focus over time, and they do very much have focus areas over time, and that, you know, is surely coming in the medicinal cannabis space. And I've been anticipating certain kind of enforcement measures they're going to put in place for quite some time. So the advice I'd give to companies is not just to look at, you know, to be independent in your own thinking as to what's required, right? Don't just look at the market and say, oh, so and so is doing this, therefore that's okay, because it's not. Those 19 licenses that got cancelled and revoked and suspended, they might have thought that, right?
No, exactly.
So it's about instead creating your own intelligence around how to translate the regulatory requirements into practice, and they do need translating, and by people who have expertise, and then, you know, carving out your own path to future-proof the business. That's what I would advise. And if you want to ground that into an example of that translation of regulatory requirements, there is no, and this is a point of frustration I sometimes hear, there is no like monograph that covers all of your acceptance criteria for a cannabis product. We've got the new cannabis flower monograph, sure, but it doesn't cover all of the acceptance criteria and requirements of the product. And that's because there's a whole range of monographs already in place, compendial standards at the European level that's filtered into the British Pharmacopoeia that experts can leverage and understand as to what's applicable to your product.
Yeah, I don't know. It kind of pains me to see it sometimes, but I think what you're saying there about sort of being a bit more intelligent about it and sticking to your guns and not copying just because other people are doing it doesn't mean that's the right thing to do. And I think that's probably why I end up saying to a lot of companies as well is that yeah, you might, there's what you're seeing, and then there's what people are doing behind the scenes, and then there's also what you should be doing and what's legal and appropriate right now. And I guess there's different people have appetites for risk and short-term, long-term mentalities. There's a lot of variation.
And the import distribution business, the Spectrum Therapeutics, was a huge learning. It was a huge learning for me. And one thing there was, it sounds a bit cheesy, but the right thing to do is often the best thing to do. And coming back to my point of, you know, if you have to do something, do it properly. Like an example within that is that, you know, you need to, you have the import process that sets in a number of patients that you're bringing the product in for. If you're bringing it in for that set number of patients, that's an allocated allotment to that physician or that clinic, right? Now, if you go away, as I saw others around early stages, I don't know what it's like now, but then just selling it wherever you like, you're not respecting that allocation that should be, even if, you know, it should be by rights and an established group of patients that you need to reserve that product for. Now, if you do that and you listen to that, then what you're doing is you're securing stability in your supply chain. Yes, it's a headache. Yes, it's hard to manage, but it feeds into a whole kind of supply demand planning system, and also making sure that when patient rocks up at the clinic, there's product for them. So doing the right thing is often the best thing, even if it takes a lot of work.
I appreciate you saying that, Jaydon, because that's a rare, I say a rare perspective. It's the proper approach, I think, but then something that you rarely hear when it comes to just what goes on behind the scenes and in the industry, and again, the reality versus the paper.
And you've got a whole tension there between, you know, people who are across that focus and the regulatory quality requirements and that focus versus the commercial interests, of course, and that needs to be healthily balanced within a company. You know, you see that very clearly in the pharmaceutical world. You know, where you know, and I'm not at all an advocate of the pharmaceutical industry in general, Let's make that really clear. But that balance between, you know, the scientific teams and the commercial teams, and the segregation of the two, is very clear in most companies.
On that note, then, I think, Jaydon, for people that want to get in touch with you and have very specific questions around their projects and their work, how is best for them to get in touch with you? We'll have you in the community so people can access you, chat, and say hello and come and interact. But what would your guidance be to people that have maybe been impacted or affected by what we've been talking about and be interested in a conversation with you?
Yeah, I'd encourage. We're just about to launch just a brochure website with our expanded consulting offerings. So I'd encourage that maybe, you know, have a look at that and see what specific kind of services might might benefit from, just so we can have, you know, a good structured discussion from the outset of how we might help. But also, if someone is, you know, early stage, committed and able to, you know, go in this journey and looking for, you know, guidance at that earlier, higher level, and a more joined up approach across those offerings, then yeah, that would also be a conversation to have, you know, and we can go through kind of requirement gathering and such like. But yeah, that
We'll
would
get
be
them signposted to you in every way we can, Jaydon.
Yeah, and with respect to contacting, we'll put contact link on our brochure website, which is to come. But I'm happy, of course, to share my email and yeah.
Superstar.
Yeah.
Top man. Well, thank you very much, Jaydon, for giving us a walkthrough of and illuminating one of the most complex, debated, and maybe frustrating topics as well that people sort of bounce on and off of and seem to get lost in the labyrinth of. So thank you for taking the time to sit with me and start unveiling that for people, some of the pitfalls and the risks. And thank you very much for sharing your professional perspective as well, Jaydon. Very much appreciated. And thank you everyone for listening. We're gonna put all of Jaydon's links and sort of ways of getting in touch with him in the video description. So if you have been affected, do get in touch with Jaydon. And if you do have any cannabinoid needs, questions, problems, someone in the community will be able to help you. If not Jaydon, there's someone in there for every eventuality. So we look forward to another podcast and look forward to welcoming small people to the community. And a big thank you, Jaydon, for all the hard work you do and for keeping everyone on the right side of the law and for helping translate cannabinoid science into useful therapeutic drugs. So many thanks from myself, and thank you from the GCS team as well, Jaydon. Top work.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.